Jason Carter was a hard-working father who loved his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, more than anything. Ever since her mother passed away, he had been doing his best to take care of her. He made sure she had everything she needed: new clothes, a warm bed, and plenty of love. But there was one thing he worried about: the school lunch. Lily often came home complaining about the food at school. "Dad, the food tastes funny," she would say. "Sometimes it smells weird." Jason always listened, but he thought maybe she was just being picky. After all, school lunches weren't supposed to be fancy. He remembered eating boring meals when he was a kid too. But one day, he decided to find out the truth for himself. That morning, Jason dropped Lily off at school like always. But instead of heading to work, he parked his car around the corner and waited. He wanted to surprise her at lunchtime. It wasn't just about the food. He also wanted to see how she was doing at school. Being a single dad was tough, and he often worried if he was doing enough. When the lunch bell finally rang, Jason walked into the cafeteria. He spotted Lily right away, sitting at a long table with her friends. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw him. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she asked, her face lighting up. "I thought I'd have lunch with my favorite girl," Jason said with a grin. Lily smiled, but then she glanced at her lunch tray with hesitation. Jason noticed it right away. She looked nervous, almost like she didn't want him to see her food. A cafeteria worker handed him a tray so he could eat with the kids. Jason sat down next to Lily and took a look at what was on his plate. That's when he noticed something strange. The mashed potatoes had a weird greenish tint. The chicken looked pale and undercooked. The milk carton had a date that seemed off. He picked it up and squinted at the label. His heart skipped a beat. The milk had expired over a week ago. He looked around. Other kids were eating without noticing anything wrong. Some poked at their food without much interest. A few, like Lily, weren't eating at all. "Dad," Lily whispered, "I told you the food was bad." Jason frowned. He took a closer look at the bread roll. At first, it seemed fine, but then he saw it, a tiny spot of mold on the side. He felt his stomach twist. How could the school be serving this to kids? He turned to a little boy sitting across from him. "Hey, buddy," Jason said gently. "How's your food?" The boy shrugged. "Sometimes it tastes bad, but the teachers say we have to eat it." Jason's jaw tightened. He looked over at the lunch workers. They were busy serving more trays, acting as if nothing was wrong. Did they know about this? How long had this been going on? Jason had come to surprise his daughter, but now he felt like he had walked into something much bigger. His mind raced. Should he say something right now? Should he talk to the principal? Then, as he glanced back at Lily's tray, something caught his eye. He leaned in closer, his stomach turned. A tiny worm wriggled out of the apple slice on her plate. Jason shot up from his seat. His heart pounded. This wasn't just bad food. This was dangerous. And he wasn't going to let his daughter, or any other kid, eat another bite. Something had to be done. Immediately. Jason's hands clenched into fists as he stared at the tiny worm wriggling on Lily's apple slice. His stomach twisted in disgust. How could the school serve something like this to children? He quickly grabbed a napkin and covered the apple before Lily could see it. He didn't want to scare her, but he knew one thing for sure. This was not okay. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He couldn't just walk away. "Lily," he said softly, "have you told your teacher about the food?" She shook her head. Some kids did, but she told them to stop complaining. Jason's jaw tightened. He looked around the cafeteria, watching the other kids eat. Some trays had the same greenish mashed potatoes, the same undercooked chicken. He even saw another kid sniff his milk carton, wrinkle his nose, and push it away. His eyes moved to the lunch staff behind the counter. They worked quickly, scooping food onto trays and handing them to the children. None of them seemed to notice or care that the food looked wrong. Jason couldn't stay silent. He stood up and walked over to one of the lunch ladies. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a hairnet. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I think there's something wrong with the food." The woman barely looked at him. "Lunch is the same as always, sir." Jason frowned. "No, it's not. My daughter's food has mold, and there's a worm in her fruit." The lunch lady sighed. "If you have a problem, you can talk to the principal." Jason stared at her in disbelief. That was it. No concern, no apology. He felt anger bubbling inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Yelling wouldn't help. "Fine," he said. "I will." He turned back to Lily. "Come on, sweetheart. We're going to the office." Lily hesitated. "Am I in trouble?" Jason softened. "No, honey. But someone needs to fix this." As they walked out of the cafeteria, Jason glanced back. A few kids were still eating, not knowing their food could make them sick. Others had pushed their trays away, their faces filled with the same hesitation Lily had shown. This wasn't just one bad meal. This was a real problem. Jason had no idea what he was about to uncover, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this go. Jason held Lily's hand as they walked down the hallway toward the principal's office. His mind raced with questions. How long had the school been serving bad food? Had other parents complained? And why was nothing being done about it? When they reached the office, a woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Hello, Mr. Carter. How can I help you?" "I need to speak with the principal," Jason said firmly. "It's about the school lunches." The woman hesitated. "She's in a meeting right now. Can I take a message?" Jason shook his head. "No, this is urgent. I just found a worm in my daughter's food." The woman's smile disappeared. "Oh," she said quietly. She glanced toward the principal's door, then back at Jason. "Let me check if she's available." A few minutes later, Jason and Lily were sitting in front of Principal Harris, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a serious expression. She folded her hands on the desk and listened as Jason explained what he had seen in the cafeteria. When he finished, she let out a small sigh. "Mr. Carter, I understand your concern, but we follow strict guidelines for our school lunches." Jason's eyes narrowed. Guidelines. Are moldy bread and expired milk part of the guidelines? The principal's lips tightened. "Sometimes mistakes happen, but our food is inspected regularly." Jason pulled out his phone. "I took pictures of Lily's food. Do these look like simple mistakes to you?" He showed her the photos. Greenish mashed potatoes, pale undercooked chicken, and the apple slice where the worm had been. Principal Harris's face paled slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I will speak with the cafeteria staff." "That's not enough," Jason said, his voice firm. "This food is making kids sick. Have you had complaints from other parents?" The principal hesitated. "Some," she admitted, "but the district provides our meals. We don't control what is sent to us." Jason clenched his fists. "Then why hasn't anything been done?" "There are rules, Mr. Carter," she said. "We can't just change food suppliers overnight." Jason stared at her in disbelief. "So you'd rather let kids eat unsafe food?" Before the principal could respond, there was a knock at the door. A teacher poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have another student feeling sick after lunch." Jason's heart dropped. How many kids were getting sick? How long had this been happening? He turned back to Principal Harris. "I'm not leaving until I know this will be fixed." She sighed. "I will call the food supplier and look into the complaints." Jason shook his head. That wasn't good enough. He wasn't going to wait for more children to get sick. As he stood up, he made a decision. It was time to take this to the next level. Jason walked out of the principal's office, his mind racing. He knew talking to the school wasn't enough. Too many kids were eating unsafe food, and nothing was being done about it. If the school wasn't going to act fast, he would. "Dad, what are we going to do?" Lily asked as they walked down the hallway. Jason squeezed her hand. We're going back to the cafeteria. Lily looked surprised. Why? Jason took a deep breath. Because I need to see more. I need proof. Back in the cafeteria, most of the kids had finished eating. The lunch staff was cleaning up, throwing trays into large trash bins. Jason walked over to one of the workers. "Excuse me," he said. "Where does the school get its food from?" The worker, an older man, gave him a tired look. "We get shipments every week from the district supplier." "Have you ever noticed anything wrong with the food?" Jason asked. The man hesitated. He looked around, then leaned in and whispered, off the record, "Yeah, a lot of times. The food comes in looking bad. We complain, but nothing changes. We just serve what we're given." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. So the cafeteria staff knew the food was bad, but they had no choice. "Can I see where the food is stored?" Jason asked. The man sighed. "I could lose my job for this, but..." He glanced around again, then nodded. "Follow me." Jason and Lily followed him through a side door into the kitchen. It smelled of old grease and cleaning chemicals. The man led them to a large refrigerator and opened the door. Jason peered inside, and what he saw made his stomach turn. There were boxes of frozen chicken, but some of them were ripped open, exposing the meat to the air. The vegetables were wilted and brown. A crate of apples had black spots covering them. Jason even saw milk cartons stacked in the back, each one past its expiration date. "This is what we get," the worker said, "and we're told to serve it." Jason took out his phone and snapped pictures. This wasn't just one bad meal. This was a pattern of neglect. Kids were eating food that could make them sick, and the school was ignoring it. Just then, Jason heard a voice behind him. "What do you think you're doing?" He turned to see another cafeteria worker, a woman in a white apron, staring at him with narrowed eyes. Jason stood his ground. "I'm taking pictures of the food your school is serving kids. This isn't okay." The woman crossed her arms. "You're not allowed back here. You need to leave." Jason took one last picture, then put his phone away. "I'm leaving," he said, "but I'm not done with this." He took Lily's hand, and they walked back out to the main cafeteria. Jason's heart was pounding. He had seen enough. The school wasn't going to fix this on its own. It was time to take action. As they stepped outside into the fresh air, Jason pulled out his phone again. It was time to call someone who would do something about this. He dialed 911. Jason's hands were steady as he held the phone to his ear. He had never called 911 for something like this before, but he knew he had no choice. This wasn't just a small problem. It was dangerous. 911. "What's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. Jason took a deep breath. "I'm at Maplewood Elementary, and the school is serving unsafe food to children. I found moldy bread, expired milk, and even a worm in my daughter's lunch. Kids are getting sick, and no one is fixing it." There was a short silence. Then the operator said, "Sir, are you saying the food is contaminated?" "Yes," Jason said firmly, "and I have pictures to prove it." "Understood. I'm sending health inspectors and emergency responders to check the situation. Stay on the scene if you can." Jason ended the call, his heart pounding. He looked down at Lily, who had been watching him the whole time. "Are we in trouble, Dad?" she asked quietly. Jason crouched down and smiled at her. "No, sweetheart. We're helping. No kid should have to eat food that can make them sick." Lily nodded, but Jason could tell she was nervous. He stood up and took her hand. "Come on, let's wait outside." As they walked back toward the front of the school, Jason noticed other parents arriving to pick up their kids. He spotted a woman he recognized, Mrs. Johnson, the mother of one of Lily's classmates. "Jason, what's going on?" she asked, frowning. "I saw you in the cafeteria earlier." Jason quickly explained what he had found. Mrs. Johnson's eyes widened in shock. "That's awful. My son has been complaining about stomachaches after lunch. I thought he just didn't like the food, but now I'm worried." Jason nodded. Help me spread the word. Parents need to know what's going on. Within minutes, more parents were gathering, whispering to each other, looking angry and concerned. Some of them had also noticed problems with the food, but hadn't known what to do. Then the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 police cars and a health department vehicle pulled up in front of the school. A few officers and 2 inspectors stepped out. The principal, Mrs. Harris, came rushing outside, looking alarmed. What is going on? She demanded. Jason stepped forward. I called 911, he said calmly. Your school is serving unsafe food, and something had to be done. Mrs. Harris's face turned red. You had no right. One of the inspectors interrupted her. Ma'am, we need to inspect the kitchen immediately. The principal hesitated but had no choice. She led them inside, while Jason and the other parents waited anxiously outside. Minutes felt like hours. Parents kept talking, sharing their children's experiences. Some had even called their doctors, realizing their kids' stomachaches and illnesses might be connected to the food. Finally, the inspectors and police officers came back out. One of them walked up to Jason. You were right, the inspector said. We found multiple violations, expired food, improper storage, and signs of contamination. The cafeteria is being shut down for investigation. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. The principal looked pale, knowing this was serious. One of the officers turned to her. Ma'am, we need to contact the district. This situation could be a health hazard. Jason felt relief wash over him. Something was finally being done. The school couldn't ignore this anymore. He looked down at Lily and squeezed her hand. See, speaking up was the right thing to do. She smiled up at him. You're a hero, Dad. Jason chuckled. No, sweetheart. I'm just a dad who cares. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Jason stood outside the school, watching as the health inspectors and police officers moved quickly. Parents whispered to one another, their faces filled with worry and anger. The school cafeteria was officially shut down, but Jason knew this wasn't the end. A few minutes later, Principal Harris walked back outside, looking pale and shaken. She cleared her throat and raised her hands. Everyone, please listen, she called. The crowd quieted down, waiting for answers. The health department is conducting a full investigation, she continued. Until further notice, the cafeteria will remain closed. The school district will arrange alternative meal options for the children. Parents started shouting questions. How long has this been going on? Why didn't you do anything before? My son has been sick for weeks. Is it because of the food? Principal Harris looked overwhelmed. Jason stepped forward. The parents deserve answers, he said firmly. She hesitated, then let out a sigh. We did receive complaints, she admitted, but the food is provided by the district. We don't prepare it here, and we don't have control over what's delivered. Jason frowned. So you knew about the bad food? She shifted uncomfortably. We reported some issues, but the supplier assured us the food was safe. Jason shook his head. That's not good enough. You saw kids getting sick and did nothing. The crowd murmured in agreement. Some parents looked furious. Others looked heartbroken, realizing their children had been eating unsafe meals. Just then, one of the health inspectors walked up, holding a clipboard. He turned to the parents. We found multiple health violations, he announced. Expired food, moldy produce, and evidence of cross-contamination. These conditions are unacceptable for a school. Jason felt a surge of anger. He had suspected things were bad, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach turn. A police officer stepped forward next. We will be questioning the food supplier and investigating whether any laws were broken, he said. For now, we advise parents to monitor their children's health and report any illnesses to their doctors. A mother in the crowd wiped tears from her eyes. My daughter was sick last week, she said. I thought it was a stomach bug, but now I'm not so sure. Others nodded, realizing the same thing. Jason took a deep breath. "We can't let this happen again," he said, turning to the parents. "We need to demand better food for our kids." A father nearby nodded. "We should contact the school board. Make them find a new food supplier." A woman added, "And make sure they do regular inspections so this never happens again." Jason could see it in their faces. The parents weren't going to let this go. The principal cleared her throat. "I understand your frustration," she said. "I'll be meeting with the district to discuss what happens next." Jason narrowed his eyes. "We'll be at that meeting too," he said. "This time, the parents will have a say." The crowd murmured in agreement. The school could no longer ignore them. As the police and health inspectors packed up, Jason looked down at Lily. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" She nodded. "I'm glad you told them, Dad." Jason smiled and hugged her. "Me too." But he wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning of the fight for better school meals. The next morning, Jason sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. News about the school's cafeteria shutdown had spread fast. Several local news stations had picked up the story, and parents were posting angry comments online. Lily sat across from him, eating a bowl of cereal. "Dad, do you think they'll fix the lunches now?" she asked. Jason sighed. "I hope so, sweetheart. But we can't just wait and see. We have to make sure they do." Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Johnson, one of the other parents. "Meeting at the school board office today at 3 p.m. We need to be there." Jason nodded to himself. This was their chance to demand real change. The school board meeting. At 3 p.m., Jason arrived at the school board office. The room was packed with parents, teachers, and even some students. The school district officials sat at a long table at the front, looking serious. Principal Harris was there too, looking uncomfortable. One of the board members, an older man with glasses, tapped his microphone. "We understand there are concerns about the school's food program," he said. "We are investigating the matter." Jason stood up. "Investigating isn't enough," he said firmly. "We want answers. Why was bad food served to our kids for so long?" A woman next to him added, "My son has been sick for weeks. How can we trust the food when no one was checking it?" The board members exchanged glances. Finally, one of them spoke. "The district contracts food suppliers based on state guidelines. We assumed they were following health standards." Jason clenched his fists. But they weren't following health standards. The cafeteria workers even admitted they knew the food was bad. The board members whispered among themselves. Then another one said, "We will be looking into new suppliers and increasing inspections." Jason shook his head. "That's not enough. We want a guarantee that our kids will get safe, healthy meals. We need real changes, not just promises." A few parents clapped in agreement. Others shouted, "That's right," and "No more excuses." The district's response. One of the board members, a woman in a blue suit, leaned forward. "We hear your concerns. We will immediately suspend the current food supplier and bring in an independent inspector to review all future meals before they are served." Jason crossed his arms. "And what about long-term changes?" The woman nodded. "We will form a parent food committee to oversee meal quality. Parents like you will have a voice in what is served." The room filled with murmurs. Parents looked at each other, surprised but hopeful. Mrs. Johnson stood up. "That's a good start, but we'll be watching. If things don't change, we will take this higher." The board members nodded. Understood. Jason felt a wave of relief. They had won this battle, but he knew it wasn't over. A step forward. As Jason and the other parents walked out of the meeting, Lily ran up to him. "Did we win, Dad?" He smiled and picked her up. "We made a big difference today, but we'll keep making sure things get better." She hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you." Jason looked around at the other parents, who were talking and smiling. They had stood up for their kids, and they weren't backing down. But the real change was just beginning. A week after the school board meeting, Jason walked Lily to school. It felt different now. There was a sense of hope in the air. Parents had spoken up, and real changes were happening. But Jason knew that promises weren't enough. He had to see the results for himself. As they reached the front doors, Mrs. Johnson and a few other parents greeted him. They brought in a new food supplier, she said, and today, inspectors are checking every meal before it's served. Jason nodded. That's what we fought for. Lily smiled. Can we go see the cafeteria? Jason grinned. Let's check it out. A fresh start in the cafeteria. Inside the cafeteria, the atmosphere was different. Gone were the strange smells and the sad-looking trays of food. Instead, Jason saw fresh fruits and vegetables, clean trays, and neatly prepared meals. Workers looked more confident, and a health inspector stood nearby, checking everything carefully. Jason walked up to one of the cafeteria staff members. How are things today? The woman smiled. Much better. The new food supplier actually listens to our concerns. We're only serving fresh, high-quality meals now. Lily grabbed a tray and looked at her lunch. A sandwich made with fresh bread, a side of crisp apple slices, and a small container of yogurt. She took a bite and grinned. This is so much better, Dad. Jason felt a wave of relief. It had been a tough fight, but this moment made it all worth it. The parents' victory. Later that day, Jason and the other parents met again outside the school. We did it, Mrs. Johnson said, smiling. The food is safe now. Jason nodded, and we'll make sure it stays that way. The Parent Food Committee had already started meeting with school officials, making sure the quality of meals remained high. They had also pushed for regular surprise inspections, so no one could ignore problems in the future. One of the fathers clapped Jason on the back. None of this would have happened without you speaking up. Jason shook his head. It wasn't just me. We all made this happen. A lesson learned. That night, as Jason tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at him with big bright eyes. Dad, do you think other schools have bad food too? Jason sighed. Maybe. But if parents speak up, they can change things, just like we did. Lily smiled. I'm glad you didn't give up. Jason kissed her forehead. Me too, sweetheart. Always stand up for what's right, no matter what. As he turned off the light and walked out of her room, Jason felt something deep inside him. This had started with a simple lunch visit, but in the end, it became something much bigger, a fight for every child's health and safety. And that was a fight worth winning. The end.